front page of the Telegraph today. Trump could sanction British lawyer leading ICC push for Netanyahu arrest. Let me tell you what this is about. Donald Trump is considering sanctions against a British lawyer over the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu. The Hague-based court is facing a major international backlash for its decision to issue a warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister and Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli Defense Minister. They also put out one for Mohammed Deif as well, Hamas leader who's actually not alive anymore. So that's quite an interesting one. Mike Waltz, who will serve as Mr. Trump's national security advisor, said the court had, and I quote, no credibility, and promised, again I quote, a strong response to the anti-Semitic bias of the ICC when the Trump administration takes office on the 20th of Jan. Now, Karim Khan KC, the ICC's chief prosecutor, could be among officials targeted for sanctions by Mr. Trump. Germany has signalled that it would not detain the Israeli leader because of its Nazi past and special relationship with the Jewish state, despite being a member of the International Criminal Court. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of fellow member state Hungary, has vowed to defy the order to arrest Mr. Netanyahu and instead invited him for a state visit. Britain's position remains a little bit, let's just say, tenuous, ambiguous, choose whichever word you want. What they have said, Mr. Starmer, well, Sir Keir Starmer's official spokesman, has said this, and I quote, the UK will always comply with its legal obligations as set out by domestic law and indeed international law. Make of that what you will. Now, on Friday, Israel's ambassador to the UK called on all countries to reject the ICC's farcical order to arrest Mr. Netanyahu, writing in the Telegraph, Zippy Hotovely accused the court of finding common ground with Hamas, the Islamic terror group, behind the October 7th massacre. She said, and I quote, we thank the US and other allied countries that have rejected the farcical decision of the court and call upon other nations to follow suit in rejecting its injustice. The ICC has shown that every democratic leader seeking to defend its people may become a target of the court. We've reached an astonishing new low when an international court which claims to uphold international law and human rights has found common cause with a terrorist organization that just over a year ago perpetrated the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust on its gratuitous rampage of murder, torture, kidnapping and rape. Make no mistake, this moment has sounded the death knell of the ICC. And that brings me to my question for you, which is this. Should the International Criminal Court be disbanded? 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Should the International Criminal Court be disbanded? Joining me to discuss this is Sarah Nouwen, Professor of Public International Law at the European University Institute. Very good afternoon to you, Goedemiddag. Thank you for joining me. What do you make of this? Firstly, the decision by the International Criminal Court to impose these arrest warrants?
I think they're very significant. They are very significant for the conflict and they're very significant for the court. So for the conflict, it is a clear no. In a sense, a no, even if one fights a war in self-defense, there are rules of international law one cannot violate. A war of self-defense is not an excuse to commit the war crime of starvation. It's not an excuse for crimes against humanity. Now, note, there's no conviction here. There is an arrest warrant, but it means that the International Criminal Court, the judges, not just the prosecutor, the judges of the International Criminal Court have found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that these international crimes have been committed. Now, it's also significant for the court because thus far, the court has been attacked or critiqued for its selectivity. So first, it seemed to be going only after African people who were from African descent. Then it went after Russia, Putin and Lova, but again, enemies of the West. And this is the first time that the International Criminal Court is being seen as also checking whether Western leaders or friends of the West are complying with international law.
When the court was actually set up back in 2002, not all states became members. At the moment, there are 124 member countries, but dozens of governments are not members of the International Criminal Court and its statutes. To what extent are they still bound by its rulings and indeed its arrest warrants?
So these other states are not bound by the arrest warrants that are now being issued. They are not on obligation to execute. But states parties, including the UK, including Germany, including the Netherlands, are under an obligation to arrest, even though Israel is not a state party. And that is because the accused, or the Netanyahu and Gallant, are accused of having committed these crimes on the territory of Palestine, and Palestine is a state party.
What do you make of Donald Trump, President-elect Trump, saying that he could sanction the British lawyer at the centre of all this that initially brought the argument for an arrest warrant to be issued by the court? Is this realistic? Can it be done?
He's done it before. He in 2019 he revoked then prosecutors Fatou Bensouda's visa to go to the US.
Yes, that's true.
And then in 2020 he issued an executive order that authorized asset freezes and family travel bans against Bensouda and a member of her office. And also potentially targeting those who assisted ICC investigations. It wouldn't be the first time. The Biden administration withdrew these measures, saying that even though it agreed with Trump that the ICC's actions in Afghanistan and Palestine were against its policy, it did not find sanctions the best way to deal with a court.
When you hear that the court has taken this action, how successful in other cases has the court been? Is it just simply a talking shop, or has it brought prosecutions that have actually led to punishment of people who have committed serious human rights violations?
There have been punishments, there have been convictions, but one should also define, and this is of course a very academic intervention, but define what do we mean by success. If we look only at the people who are being arrested, the court should not be held accountable for those who are arrested, because the obligation to arrest is the obligation of states parties, including the United Kingdom, if Netanyahu were to land here. So I don't think that the court should be assessed on the basis of, is it applying international law equally to all the people within its jurisdiction?
When you hear of comments like anti-Semitic bias, like Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, has said, incoming National Security Advisor, do you think that there's any merit in that, or do you think that that is really a very liberal use of the term and actually demeans the work that the ICC is doing?
Again, I would say we've been here before. When the ICC went after the Sudanese president, the supporters of the Sudanese president said that this was an anti-Islam or an anti-Islamic court. When the ICC went after the leaders of Kenya, Kenyans who supported those leaders said this is a court that goes after Africans. And now we have the supporters of Israeli leaders who say this is an anti-Semitic court. I think it's really important that ultimately the court is seen as the only thing that it's being is anti-international crimes.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Sarah Nouwen, Professor of Public International Law at the European University Institute. Look, this is very interesting because Trump has basically come out and said that, or it's being mooted that Trump could introduce sanctions on this prosecutor. This prosecutor is also being investigated, by the way, by the ICC for allegations of sexual misconduct. But that's a whole other issue, which we won't get into here. Any sanctions enforced on Mr. Khan and his staff could threaten the relationship between Britain and Mr. Trump if Sir Keir opts to comply with the arrest warrants. Now, this is very interesting because the UK is a member of the International Criminal Court. The US is not. Israel is not either. Nor are China, India, Russia, and many other countries. But there are 124 members who are, and Britain is. So presumably if Benjamin Netanyahu came here for any reason, or if his plane was refueling on way to the US, I don't know, it could be anything, you could make an argument that the British authorities would have an obligation under international law as a party to the ICC conventions to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, I want to explore that a little bit because some people would say that this is the most ridiculous situation for the UK to be in because there is a kind of a moral equivalence being drawn here by the International Criminal Court between Mohammed Daif, a Hamas leader on the one hand who's now dead, who they've also issued an arrest warrant to. So I don't quite know how that works. I mean, I don't know how you can prosecute a corpse, but that's beyond me. But anyway, they have. And drawing an equivalence between the actions of Hamas and the actions of a sovereign, independent, democratic state that tried to defend itself. Now, that said, you just heard from Sarah Nouwen there that the right to defend oneself in response to aggression against a state, which I'm all in favour of, by the way, I've always said that Israel had a right to defend itself, does not mean that that state then has a blank check to do whatever it wants in pursuit of the protection of its own people. Including adopting the so-called General's Plan in the north of Gaza, which is effectively starving the population. And by the way, we can throw in West Bank settlements for good measure, if you like, as well, into this, which I find completely reprehensible. But that's maybe another story for another day. So to kind of draw a moral equivalence here is, I think, wrong. I don't think there is a moral equivalence. But that does not mean that if a state has a right to defend itself, that it gets a free pass to do whatever it wants, irrespective of international norms. Now, you could say, well, that's all very well, but that's a theoretical argument because Israel's not a member of the International Criminal Court. Therefore, it has no jurisdiction over it whatsoever. And also, it is a democracy that has its own rules and norms and indeed functioning judicial system. So this court has got absolutely no power or jurisdiction over it whatsoever, nor can any of its actions be enforced. It has no police force. It has no means of enforcing Benjamin Netanyahu to come to The Hague to serve or face trial at all. Now, it has had some successes in the past with various African leaders. It has brought actions against them. You've heard the examples there. And it can also bring actions around four key areas. One is genocide, the intent to destroy a whole or part of a national, ethnic, racial group. War crimes, including grave breaches of the laws of war under the Geneva Conventions. Crimes against humanity or violations committed as part of a large-scale attack. And crimes of aggression, where a political or military leader plans or executes the use of armed force by a state against the territorial integrity, sovereignty, or political independence of another state. Well, you could say, well, the Gazans don't have their own state, so that hasn't definitely been transgressed. But you could make an argument that war crimes have been committed. And that's indeed the argument that is being made here, which is why they want to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the former Israeli defense minister. Now, these prosecutions can be brought in a few different ways. They can be brought by other states coming forward and making a complaint, or they can even be brought by the prosecutor themselves. Irrespective of the technicalities of all of this, the couple of things that really strike me. One is, given the fact that the International Criminal Court has got no jurisdiction whatsoever over this, and Benjamin Netanyahu, provided he doesn't go and land in any other country, or even if he does, I mean, if he goes and lands in certain countries where there is maybe members, they still might not arrest him, right? Then they've got a problem there in terms of their own implications for how they are perceived in the world themselves. And I'm talking about Britain here in particular. But other countries paying scant notice to this whatsoever.